continues to be criticized for embellishing his rank and service. After it came out over the weekend, he once claimed to be an official bikini inspector. Walz's direct superior in the National Guard says Walz knew his unit was about to deploy to Iraq and went behind the back of his superior officer to resign.
Greg Gutfeld and Megyn Kelly took one long look at Governor Tim Walz's recent town hall performance and decided they had seen enough. What followed was a verbal takedown so brutal that viewers are still talking about it. Gutfeld, known for his sharp sarcasm, didn't hold back. Megyn Kelly, always direct and fearless, joined him with her usual fiery commentary. Together, they made Tim Walz look less like a leader and more like a confused teacher who had wandered into a political meeting by mistake. Tim Walz, standing at the podium, looked like he had something to say. But once he started talking, things quickly fell apart. His sentences didn't make sense. His ideas were all over the place, and even his facial expressions looked like they didn't know what was going on. It was painful to watch. Not because the topics were tough, but because Walz seemed completely lost. It's like someone trying to explain how the internet works using only smoke signals. Greg Gutfeld wasted no time. He said Walz sounded like a man who read a Wikipedia page 5 minutes before the event and hoped no one would ask follow-up questions. Megyn Kelly added that his leadership reminded her of a magician who forgot the trick halfway through and just stood there hoping the audience would clap anyway. These weren't just jokes, they were brutal truths wrapped in sarcasm. And the audience watching at home couldn't stop laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so incredibly bad. One of the most embarrassing moments was when Walz tried to talk about immigration and diversity. His words came out in a strange loop. He kept repeating that our strength is our diversity over and over again, like a broken record. Instead of making a strong point, he made it look like he didn't understand his own message. Gutfeld pointed out that Walz was trying to be deep but ended up sounding like he was reading fortune cookies and calling it policy. And then came the part that truly stunned everyone. Walz began to talk about his time in China during the Tiananmen Square protests. At first, it seemed like he had a serious story to tell. But then he said, "I got the dates wrong." He wasn't, even in the place he claimed to be. First it was Hong Kong, then maybe China. It was all a mess. Megyn Kelly raised her eyebrows and simply said, "This guy doesn't know where he was or when." It would have been laughable if it weren't so concerning. Greg Gutfeld jumped in again, this time attacking Walz's constant excuses. When asked about his confusing answers, Walz said he speaks like everyone else. Gutfeld didn't let that slide. He joked that if everyone else spoke like that, we'd all be walking around bumping into walls. It wasn't just about one bad answer. It was about how Walz had made a habit of sounding unsure, unclear, and unprepared. The insults kept coming not because Gutfeld and Kelly were being mean, but because Walz kept giving them more reasons. When asked about economic policies, he stumbled again. Gutfeld mocked him by saying Walz talks about the economy like a guy trying to fix a car using duct tape and hope. And Kelly didn't hold back either. She said watching Walz discuss economics was like watching someone play Monopoly but still ending up in debt. Things only got worse when the topic turned to public safety and crime. During a time when people were scared, when crime was rising, Walz responded by saying they should hold a listening session. Gutfeld laughed so hard he nearly choked. He said it felt like the house was on fire, and Walz's response was to write a poem about it. Megyn Kelly added that Walz's idea of action was to wait for someone else to do something and then take credit if it worked. Then came the Taylor Swift moment. When asked about her, Walz went into a strange speech about cats, gratitude, and courage. No one really understood what he was trying to say. Kelly's response was cold and clear. She said Walz looked and sounded like Elmer Fudd, a cartoon character, that the whole moment felt off. Gutfeld added that it was like watching someone try to be deep using shallow thoughts. The two hosts weren't just mocking, they were revealing how dangerous this kind of leadership could be. When riots broke out in Minnesota, Walz delayed. Calling the National Guard, people were scared, businesses were burning, and Walz held press conferences that said nothing. Gutfeld said the governor was acting like a mall cop who walked into a war zone and decided to take a nap. Kelly said, "That kind of leadership wasn't just weak, it was careless." One of the most telling signs that Walz was in over his head came during discussions about education. Minnesota schools were struggling. Test scores were down, teachers were quitting, and students were falling behind. Walz's solution? He formed a task force. Kelly rolled her eyes and said it best. Nothing screams action like 17 meetings. And a PowerPoint about feelings. Gutfeld compared it to pulling a rabbit out of a burning hat, only to find out the rabbit had already left the building. As the night went on, more clips of Walz were played, and each one seemed worse than one. The last, his expressions were confusing, his points wandered, and his tone changed so often it felt like he was arguing with himself. At one point, even Megyn Kelly's husband reacted. A man who rarely comments on the news was so bothered by Walz's performance that he said, "This guy looks like Elmer Fudd." When you start looking like a cartoon and sounding like a confused professor, it's hard to be taken seriously. Even more troubling was Walz's record with the state budget. Minnesota had a surplus, but Walz spent it like someone who just got their first credit card. Instead of fixing problems, he created new committees and spent money on projects no one could explain. Gutfeld joked that if Walz ran your house finances, you'd be living in a tent behind a fast food restaurant. It was meant to be funny, but it also hit home for many people who saw their taxes go up and services go down. The hypocrisy didn't stop there. During the COVID pandemic, Walz imposed strict lockdowns on everyone. But then he was caught breaking his own rules. Businesses were told to shut down, families were kept apart, and people lost jobs. Meanwhile, Walz acted like the rules didn't apply to him. Kelly pointed this out sharply, saying that in his administration, "Oops, I did it again, might as well be a government position." It wasn't just unfair, it was insulting. The truth is, Tim Walz didn't just fail in one area, he failed in many. From crime and education to public health and economic planning, his leadership looked more like guesswork than governance. Gutfeld and Kelly simply said what many people were already thinking, but they said it louder, clearer, and with the kind of humor that made the truth sting even more. As the clip continued, it became more and more obvious that Tim Walz was completely out of touch. One moment that had both Greg Gutfeld and Megyn Kelly speechless was when Walz tried to explain a controversial abortion law. The way he spoke about it made no sense, and when asked a direct question about what part of the law people were upset about, he dodged, danced, and mumbled his way through a non-answer. Megyn didn't let him off easy. She looked right into the camera and said, "Governor, what exactly are you talking about?" It was the kind of moment where the silence after her question said more than any words ever could. Walz wasn't just struggling with words, he was losing control of facts. 2. From 2015 to 2023, a total of 24 babies were born alive after failed abortions in Minnesota. These were living, breathing children. But under Walz's leadership, the law that protected those babies was repealed. When asked about it, he gave a response that sounded more like a philosophy lecture than an answer. Greg Gutfeld snapped, saying, "This is not a poetry slam. It's public policy." And Kelly, she didn't hold back either. "This man makes decisions that impact lives, and he doesn't even know what those decisions are," she said. Deeper they went into Walz's record, the worse it got. When it came to public safety, Minnesota under Walz was a disaster. Crime rates shot up. Carjackings, thefts, and violent crimes were no longer headlines. They became daily life. And how? Did Walz respond? He held more meetings, more speeches, more delays. Gutfeld said it perfectly. While people were dialing 911, Walz was dialing in to Zoom calls. Instead of action, there were PowerPoints. Instead of arrests, there were apologies. One of the harshest blows came when Gutfeld compared Walz to a substitute gym teacher who accidentally got elected. He said Walz had the charisma of cold oatmeal and the decision-making skills of a confused squirrel. It was funny, but also painfully accurate. Kelly chimed in with a line that had everyone shaking their heads. If incompetence had a mascot, it would wear a North Face jacket and carry a clipboard just like Walz. Every word was a punch, and Walz had no defense. And then there was his COVID response. This was where things got really serious. Businesses were crushed. Schools were closed. People lost their jobs, their homes, and their hope. Walz put the entire state on lockdown. But when it came to enforcing his own rules, he slipped right through them. He went to events, showed up maskless, and acted like the rules were just for everyone else. Kelly slammed him, saying he locked down an entire state, but couldn't follow the rules himself for a weekend. Gutfeld added, he banned everything except bad Wi-Fi and boredom. The audience wasn't just laughing, they were angry. People saw their lives turned upside down by decisions Walz made without clear reason. He claimed to follow the science, but never explained which science or why. And when people pushed back, he acted surprised. It was like watching someone light a fire and then ask, why is everything burning? Transportation in Minnesota didn't escape Walz's chaos either. Roads were falling apart. Public transit was a mess. Potholes became part of the scenery. His response? Promises of green energy and electric buses. But those promises disappeared like smoke. Electric bus proposals died before they even left the table. Meanwhile, drivers in Minnesota were out there dodging craters big enough to hold a swimming pool. Gutfeld joked that every pothole should be named after one of Walz's broken promises. Then came education. Under Walz, schools didn't just struggle, they crumbled. Test scores dropped like stones in a river. Teachers left in droves. And what did Walz do? He formed more task forces, created more panels. But students still couldn't read at grade level, and classrooms turned into political battlegrounds. Kelly described it best. It's like watching a magician pull policy ideas out of a flaming hat, only to find the rabbit had already escaped. In another moment that shocked even longtime watchers, Walz was asked about his military record. Instead of giving a clear answer, he got defensive and vague. He claimed to have served in serious situations, but gave no details. Some reports even accused him of dodging combat service in Iraq. That's not just a small mistake, that's a massive breach of trust. Gutfeld, without missing a beat, said if he was any more vague, he'd disappear. It was brutal. But people needed to hear it. And just when you thought it couldn't get more ridiculous, Walz commented on Taylor Swift. That's right, he went from talking about public policy to praising Taylor Swift's bravery as a cat owner. It was so out of place, so strange, that Megyn Kelly had to pause. She stared at the screen and said, "Is this real?" Gutfeld joked that Walz talks like a man trying to win a debate at a coffee shop while distracted by a squirrel outside the window. The roast didn't stop. Walz's press conferences became another target. Gutfeld said they were like TED Talks, only instead of inspiration, they delivered confusion. Every time Walz opened his mouth, it felt like your brain was buffering. He talks for 30 minutes and says nothing, Kelly added. It's like watching a movie trailer for a film that doesn't exist. Even Walz's own slogan came under attack. One Minnesota, he called it. But under his watch, the state was more divided than ever. Policies didn't unite, they confused. Actions didn't solve, they delayed. And all the while, Walz kept smiling, as if pretending everything was fine would make it true. Gutfeld said it best. Minnesota didn't get a leader. They got a malfunctioning robot with a government badge. Kelly didn't hold back either. She said Walz governed like a man who wandered into leadership. got mistaken for someone important, and decided to ride it out until someone noticed. His only true skill, she said, was avoiding blame. When things went wrong, Walz blamed everyone else. When things went right, rare as that was, he gave himself a pat on the back so hard it could be heard across state lines. By this point in the roast, it was clear that Walz wasn't just unprepared. He was a cautionary tale. A warning of what happens when you elect someone based on empty slogans and soft speeches. Gutfeld and Kelly weren't trying to be mean. They were trying to show the truth through humor. Yes, but also through sharp, painful honesty. Walz had been exposed. Not by enemies, not by scandal, but by his own record, his own words, and his own failures. And that's what made the entire segment so powerful. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about party lines. It was about leadership, real leadership. The kind that takes responsibility, speaks clearly, and acts when action is needed. Walz had none of that. And Gutfeld and Kelly made sure everyone saw it.